In the year 1775, England stood at a particular intersection of social order and literary convention. The nation's reading public, drawn primarily from the propertied classes, maintained strict expectations regarding the proper subjects and forms of published writing. The novel, still a relatively recent development in English letters, existed under considerable suspicion as a potentially frivolous or morally dubious entertainment, particularly when compared to the established respectability of sermons, histories, and classical translations. Those who wrote novels often felt compelled to defend their work through lengthy prefaces explaining their moral and educational purposes, and female authors especially found themselves navigating a complex set of social prohibitions regarding public visibility and appropriate feminine behavior. The structure of English society during this period rested upon rigid hierarchies determined largely by birth and property ownership. The gentry, that class situated between the titled aristocracy above and the commercial middle classes below, occupied a position requiring careful attention to propriety and decorum. A gentleman's family derived its status not from trade or profession, but from inherited land, and the preservation of this land through careful marriage and inheritance practices consumed much of the social energy of these families. The younger sons of such families, unable to inherit the estate that would pass to the eldest male heir, typically entered the church, the military, or occasionally the law, while daughters possessed virtually no independent economic prospects beyond marriage or the precarious position of governess or companion to wealthier relatives. Women of the gentry lived under particular constraints that shaped every aspect of their daily existence. Their education, when it occurred at all in formal terms, emphasized accomplishments rather than intellectual development. Music, drawing, needlework, perhaps some French or Italian, and the cultivation of an agreeable manner in company. The expectation that a young woman would pass seamlessly from her father's household to her husband's household, bringing with her a suitable dowry and the promise of legitimate heirs, organized the social calendar of assemblies, visits, and carefully supervised interactions between unmarried young people. A woman who reached her late 20s without securing a marriage faced increasingly limited options and declining social status, while the loss of a father's protection through death or financial reversal could reduce even genteel women to positions of dependency on the charity of relatives. The literary marketplace of the period operated according to its own distinct set of conventions and economic relationships. Authors typically sold their manuscripts to publishers either outright for a one-time payment or on terms of shared profits after expenses, with little protection against unauthorized reprinting or adaptation. The circulating libraries that had emerged during the previous decades exerted considerable influence over what publishers chose to print, as their guaranteed purchases represented a substantial portion of a novel's likely sales. These libraries, in turn, responded to the tastes and moral expectations of their subscribers, creating a system that tended to reward certain types of fiction while discouraging others. The multi-volume format of most novels, typically priced at several shillings per volume, placed them beyond the reach of all but the wealthy for purchase, making the circulating library system essential to the novel's commercial viability. The reviewing practices of the period shaped public reception of new publications through journals and magazines that wielded considerable influence over what the educated classes read and how they understood literary merit. The major reviews, the Critical Review, the Monthly Review, the British Critic, published assessments that could determine a book's commercial success or failure. These reviews applied standards derived from classical rhetoric and moral philosophy, evaluating works not merely for technical accomplishment, but for their potential effects on readers' characters and conduct. Novels faced particular scrutiny regarding their moral tendency, with reviewers expressing frequent concern about the potential for fiction to mislead young readers, especially young women, about the nature of life and appropriate behavior. The rise of the professional author during the late 18th century created new possibilities and new anxieties about the relationship between writing and social status. A gentleman or lady who wrote for publication risked association with the commercial marketplace and the suggestion that financial necessity drove their literary production. The ideal of the amateur who wrote for private amusement or moral instruction rather than payment remained powerful, even as the economic realities of authorship meant that many writers depended on their literary earnings for survival. Women who published faced additional scrutiny regarding the propriety of public visibility and the potential conflict between literary ambition and the domestic duties considered natural to their sex. The convention of publishing novels in 3 volumes, which would dominate British fiction publishing well into the Victorian era, reflected both economic calculations and reading practices. The 3-volume format allowed circulating libraries to loan different volumes to multiple subscribers simultaneously, maximizing their return on investment. The price point, typically half a guinea per volume or roughly 31 shillings for a complete novel, placed purchase far beyond most families' means, reinforcing the dominance of the library system. This format also influenced narrative structure, as authors learned to construct plots that provided satisfying episode endings at the conclusion of each volume while maintaining suspense that would draw readers forward into subsequent volumes. The culture of reading aloud in family circles and social gatherings shaped how novels were experienced and understood during this period. Books were frequently shared among multiple readers, passed from person to person within social networks of friends and relations, and read aloud in evening gatherings where collective response to plot developments and character behavior became part of the entertainment. This communal mode of reading influenced both what authors could assume about their readers' engagement with their texts and how moral and social questions raised by novels became subjects for extended discussion and debate among readers. The Church of England provided employment and social position for many younger sons of gentry families, though the nature of these clerical positions varied considerably based on patronage and circumstance. Some clergymen held valuable livings, benefices that provided substantial annual income along with a comfortable parsonage house, while others subsisted on far more modest stipends or served as curates assisting more senior clergy. The system of private patronage, in which wealthy landowners held the right to appoint clergy to parishes on their estates, meant that family connections and social relationships often determined a clergyman's prospects more than his theological learning or pastoral dedication. A clerical position, once secured, offered relative stability and a degree of social respectability, though rarely wealth, and clergymen's families lived according to the genteel poverty that characterized much of the gentry's economic reality. The intellectual climate of the period reflected both Enlightenment rationalism and a growing interest in sensibility and emotion as legitimate subjects of philosophical and literary exploration. The previous generation had produced Samuel Richardson's epistolary novels analyzing moral psychology through extended examination of their characters' motives and feelings, while Henry Fielding had demonstrated the novel's capacity for social satire and comic realism. More recently, Gothic fiction had emerged as a popular form, emphasizing mystery, terror, and exotic settings far removed from ordinary English life. The novel of sensibility, focusing on refined feelings and moral delicacy, had established its own conventions and audience, though critics increasingly voiced concerns about the potential for such fiction to encourage excessive emotionalism and impractical expectations about life. Against this backdrop of social rigidity and literary convention, the particular circumstances of clerical families in the late 18th century bore directly on the experiences of those born into such households. The combination of genteel status with limited financial resources created specific pressures and constraints, especially for daughters who could bring neither property nor professional prospects to a marriage. The expectation that such young women would maintain the appearances appropriate to their class while possessing little actual money to support these appearances generated a complex set of accommodations and strategies, from the careful preservation and alteration of clothing to the development of talents that might make them agreeable companions without appearing to seek financial advantage through these accomplishments. On December 16, 1775, in the village of Steventon in Hampshire, a daughter was born to Reverend George Austen and his wife, Cassandra Lee Austen, the seventh child in what would become a family of 8 children. The rectory at Steventon, a modest establishment surrounded by agricultural land, served as both the family's home and the center of Reverend Austen's clerical duties. George Austen supplemented his clerical income by taking in boarding pupils, young men preparing for university, and by farming the glebe land attached to his position, creating a household that combined intellectual pursuits with the practical demands of agricultural supervision and the education of students. The child, named Jane after her father's favorite sister, entered a family already containing several sons and 1 daughter, Cassandra Elizabeth, born 3 years earlier. The Austen family maintained connections to more elevated social circles through Cassandra Lee Austen's aristocratic relations, though these connections provided more in the way of social prestige than financial benefit. The contrast between the family's genteel origins and its modest actual circumstances characterized much of the household's daily reality, as the Austens necessarily practiced economies while maintaining the manners and expectations of their class. Reverend Austen's position as rector of Steventon provided the family with security of tenure in the rectory and the modest income associated with the living, supplemented by farming operations on the glebe lands and by the fees paid by boarding pupils. The household economy at Steventon required careful management to support a growing family on the combined income from various sources. The boarding pupils, typically sons of local gentry families preparing for university entrance, contributed substantially to the family finances while also creating additional work for Mrs. Austen and the household servants in providing meals, lodging, and supervision. The farm operations, overseen by Reverend Austen with hired labor and the assistance of a bailiff, generated income from crops and livestock, while also providing food for the household's own consumption. This combination of clerical, educational, and agricultural activities characterized many rural clerical families' strategies for achieving a comfortable, if not affluent, existence. The relationship between Jane's parents established the emotional atmosphere within which the children developed. George Austen, educated at Oxford and possessing scholarly inclinations, brought intellectual distinction to the family, while Cassandra Lee Austen contributed both aristocratic connections and practical capability in managing household affairs. The parents' encouragement of their children's reading and writing, their willingness to perform private theatricals, and their maintenance of connections with a wider world of ideas and culture through correspondence and occasional travel created an environment that valued intellectual engagement without pretending to fashionable sophistication or wealth. The earliest years of Jane's life followed patterns typical for families of their station, with infants sent to live with a village wet nurse during the first months before returning to the parsonage. This practice, common among families who could afford even modest help, reflected both medical beliefs about infant care and the practical demands of managing a household that included boarding pupils and multiple children. The Austen children grew up in an environment that valued learning and literary accomplishment, with their father's extensive library serving as both a professional resource and a source of family entertainment. The education provided to the Austen daughters occurred both formally and through the general intellectual atmosphere of the household. When Jane was 7 years old, she and Cassandra were sent to Oxford and then Southampton with their cousin Jane Cooper, supervised by Mrs. Cawley, a relative who had established herself as a teacher of young girls. This brief formal education ended abruptly when a fever spread through the school, nearly claiming the life of Jane and requiring the girls' hasty return home. A subsequent attempt at formal education placed Jane and Cassandra at the Abbey School in Reading, a more respectable establishment than Mrs. Cawley's school, though still relatively modest in its academic offerings. The Abbey School provided instruction in the typical accomplishments expected of young ladies, some French, needlework, drawing, and general knowledge, without pretending to the more rigorous intellectual training available to their brothers. The return of the girls to Steventon Rectory by the time Jane reached 11 years old marked the end of her formal education, but not the end of her learning. The household at Steventon provided access to her father's library, which contained not only the theological and classical works necessary for his profession and his tutoring of pupils, but also contemporary novels, plays, and periodicals. The family's habit of reading aloud in the evenings, sharing newly published novels, popular histories, and improving works, created a continuous exposure to literary models and contemporary styles. Jane's brothers, particularly James and Henry, who both possessed literary interests of their own, contributed to an atmosphere in which writing original compositions for family amusement represented not an unusual pursuit, but a natural extension of the household's general engagement with literature. The social world accessible to the Austen family during Jane's childhood and adolescence centered on visits to nearby estates, assemblies in the market towns of Basingstoke and Reading, and the complex web of connections maintained through correspondence and occasional visits to more distant relations. The family's position in the lower reaches of the gentry meant that while they could participate in local society and claim acquaintance with families of higher rank, they did so without the financial resources that would have made their position secure and comfortable. The necessity of careful economy, combined with the maintenance of genteel appearances, created a particular consciousness of the relationship between money and social standing, a consciousness that would later inform the economic realities that underpin so much of Jane's fictional work. The deaths and financial reverses that affected the wider family network during these years provided early lessons in the precariousness of genteel existence. The fate of relatives who had lost fortunes, or who had never possessed adequate means to support their station, demonstrated the limited options available to those who fell from their social position without the safety net of wealth. The particular vulnerability of women in such circumstances appeared clearly through the examples of aunts and cousins who had been forced into dependent positions or who had made disadvantageous marriages out of economic necessity rather than affection or compatibility. The case of Jane's Aunt Philadelphia Hancock, sister to her father George Austen, illustrated the complex strategies women employed to secure their futures when family resources proved insufficient. Philadelphia had traveled to India as a young woman, married Tyso Saul Hancock, a surgeon in the service of the East India Company, and eventually returned to England with her daughter Eliza. The family's financial circumstances remained perpetually uncertain, dependent on Tyso Hancock's earnings and investments in India, which proved unreliable. Philadelphia's navigation of social connections, her cultivation of potential patrons, including Warren Hastings, who served as Eliza's godfather, and her ultimate return to England to secure her daughter's future demonstrated the entrepreneurial approaches women of limited means adopted to improve their prospects within the constraints of respectable behavior. The example of Eliza de Feuillide, Jane's cousin through her Aunt Philadelphia, provided another model of how genteel women managed uncertain circumstances. Eliza had married a French aristocrat, the Comte de Feuillide, and lived in France before the Revolution forced her return to England. The Comte's eventual execution during the Terror illustrated the catastrophic reversals that could overtake even those who had appeared securely positioned, while Eliza's subsequent marriage to Jane's brother Henry after several years of widowhood demonstrated the pragmatic considerations that informed marriage choices even for women who possessed some independent means and social sophistication. The theatrical performances at Steventon, in which Eliza participated enthusiastically during her visits, brought a cosmopolitan glamour to the rural rectory, while also providing Jane with direct observation of a woman who managed social and financial uncertainty through charm, performance, and strategic relationships. The broader network of Austen family connections, including various uncles, aunts, and cousins whose fortunes rose or fell according to inheritance, marriage, and professional success, provided Jane with extensive opportunities to observe how family relationships functioned under financial strain and how social position could be maintained or lost through circumstances both within and beyond individual control. The experience of watching relatives negotiate their positions within this complex social and economic network, making choices about where to live, whom to associate with, and how to present themselves to maintain status despite limited resources, informed the keen attention to gradations of social rank and the economic calculations underlying personal relationships that would characterize her mature fiction. Jane's relationship with her sister Cassandra developed during these years into the central emotional attachment of her life. The two sisters shared a room, shared confidences, and developed a partnership that would endure throughout Jane's life. Cassandra, as the elder sister, possessed a more placid temperament, while Jane demonstrated early signs of the keen observation and satirical wit that would later characterize her writing. The letters between the sisters, when necessity occasionally separated them, reveal the completeness of their trust and the detailed nature of their communication about family matters, social events, and personal reflections. The theatrical performances that the Austen family organized during Jane's teenage years offered both entertainment and a form of social education. These private theatricals, performed in the rectory barn and later in the dining room, involved elaborate preparation of costumes, memorization of scripts, and the performance of contemporary comedies before an audience of family, neighbors, and friends. Jane's participation in these performances, both as actor and later as author of short dramatic pieces and comic sketches, provided practical experience in the construction of dialogue, the pacing of comic scenes, and the observation of how particular character types and situations generated laughter or interest from an audience. The juvenilia that Jane wrote during her teenage years, preserved in 3 manuscript notebooks, demonstrates both the literary influences she absorbed and the developing voice that would later distinguish her published works. These early pieces range from brief burlesques of popular literary forms to longer narrative experiments, all marked by a satirical awareness of the conventions they invoke and a willingness to push those conventions to absurd extremes. The melodramatic excesses of novels of sensibility, the improbable coincidences of picaresque adventures, the pompous moralizing of conduct literature, All of these became subjects for comic treatment in writings shared primarily with family members and close friends who could appreciate the humor in these literary parodies. The practical realities of household management and the economics of a clerical family's existence formed another dimension of Jane's education during these years. The supervision of servants, the planning of meals within limited budgets, the preservation of food, the making and alteration of clothing, the management of visiting, all of these practical skills required attention and practice. The expectation that young women of the gentry would eventually manage their own households, whether as wives or as elder daughters assisting aging parents, meant that these practical concerns demanded as much attention as the more decorative accomplishments emphasized in discussions of female education. The years that followed Jane Austen's youth, roughly from her late teens through her mid-20s, established the patterns of daily life and creative work that would characterize her development as a writer. The morning hours in the Steventon Rectory typically began early, with household tasks that could not be delegated entirely to the modest staff of servants the family could afford. The routine of a country household demanded attention to practical matters, the supervision of cleaning, the planning of meals from available resources, the preservation of fruits and vegetables from the garden, and the endless tasks associated with needlework and the maintenance of clothing in an era when garments represented significant investments that required careful repair and alteration. Jane's practice as a writer occurred within these practical constraints and competing demands on her time. She wrote at a small desk in the family sitting room, not in the privacy of a dedicated study, but in the common space where family members came and went, where visitors might arrive unexpectedly, and where the ordinary business of daily life continued around her. The door of the sitting room, which creaked when opened, reportedly provided her with warning of approaching footsteps, allowing her to conceal her manuscript pages under blotting paper before whoever entered could observe her at work. This necessity of concealment reflected both modesty about her writing and an awareness that serious literary ambition might appear unseemly or peculiar in a young woman whose primary business should have been the cultivation of domestic skills and social graces. The development of her craft proceeded through a combination of wide reading, careful revision of earlier attempts, and the beginning of more ambitious narrative projects. The juvenile writings had explored various forms and registers through brief experiments and parodies, but during the late 1790s, Jane began work on epistolary novels that attempted to achieve serious fictional effects while incorporating the satirical perspectives she had developed through her comic pieces. Eleanor and Marianne, written in letter form, explored contrasting temperaments and approaches to emotional expression, while First Impressions took up the complications arising from initial misunderstandings and the gradual revision of judgments through closer acquaintance. The epistolary format, which had dominated much 18th-century fiction from Richardson's novels through more recent works of sentiment and Gothic romance, offered both opportunities and limitations for the fictional effects Jane sought to achieve. The convention of letters exchanged between characters allowed for intimate access to their thoughts and feelings, while also constraining narrative flexibility, as events could only be narrated through characters' first-person accounts written at specific moments. The decision to move away from the epistolary format in her later revisions reflected both a recognition of these constraints and a developing interest in narrative techniques that would allow for more fluid movement between characters' perspectives and for ironic distance between narrator and characters. The process of revision that characterized Jane's working methods involved not merely polishing sentences, but reconsidering fundamental aspects of structure and characterization. The transformation of Eleanor and Marianne into Sense and Sensibility required not only changing from letters to third-person narrative, but reimagining how readers would access the sisters' inner lives and how the contrast between their temperaments would be demonstrated through action and dialogue rather than through their own written reflections. Similarly, the extensive revision that First Impressions underwent to become Pride and Prejudice involved sharpening the social satire, refining the characterization of secondary figures, and adjusting the pacing to ensure that readers' judgments of characters developed in parallel with Elizabeth Bennet's own evolving understanding. The practical challenges of authorship in this period included not only the labor of composition, but also the production of fair copies suitable for submission to publishers or for sharing with family readers whose responses helped shape subsequent revisions. The writing itself proceeded slowly, with quill pens that required frequent trimming and resharpening, ink that could blot or fade, and paper that represented a significant expense requiring careful use. The need to preserve drafts, while also managing limited storage space, meant that decisions about what to keep and what to discard occurred throughout the composition process, though Jane appears to have retained at least some drafts and fragments that provided material for later reworking. The routine of writing occurred in fragments, stolen moments between other obligations, and fitted around the social demands that continued to structure genteel existence. Morning calls, evening assemblies, extended visits to relations, and the reception of guests. All of these absorbed time and energy while also providing the observation of manners, conversations, and social dynamics that fed into the fictional worlds Jane was constructing. The assemblies at Basingstoke, where local families gathered for dancing and conversation, offered regular opportunities to observe the intricate negotiations of courtship, the subtle communications of approval or disdain, and the ways in which very small differences in fortune or connection could determine the course of a young person's life. The family's removal from Steventon to Bath in 1801, when Reverend George Austen decided to retire from his clerical duties, disrupted the established routines that had supported Jane's writing practice. Bath, a fashionable resort city famous for its hot springs and its role as a marriage market for the genteel classes, provided a different social environment from the rural Hampshire parish where Jane had spent her first 25 years. The furnished lodgings that the family occupied in Bath lacked the settled quality of the rectory at Steventon, and the public nature of life in a resort town, with its emphasis on promenading, attending assemblies, and participating in the social ritual of the pump room, left less space for the private concentration that writing required. The practical demands on Jane's time increased during the Bath years as the family's financial circumstances grew more constrained with her father's retirement. The income from his clerical positions ceased, leaving the family dependent on his savings and the modest contributions from their sons who had begun their own careers. The economics of maintaining genteel appearances in Bath, where social life revolved around public display and the consumption of leisure, strained the family's resources. Jane and Cassandra found themselves increasingly occupied with the careful management of limited funds, the alteration of clothing to maintain fashionable appearances, and the strategic acceptance or refusal of invitations based on the costs involved. During these years in Bath, Jane's writing productivity declined significantly from the energetic output of her Steventon period. The disruption of familiar routines, the lack of a private space for composition, and perhaps the psychological effects of uncertainty about the future all contributed to a relative silence. She worked on revisions of earlier manuscripts and began at least one new project, but the focused creative energy of the 1790s did not fully return. The death of her father in January 1805 introduced new pressures and anxieties as the family now faced the immediate necessity of determining how the widowed Mrs. Austen and her unmarried daughters would support themselves on the small income from investments and the promise of modest contributions from the Austen sons. The Bath years exposed Jane more directly to the social dynamics of a resort city where status competitions played out through public display and where the marriage market operated with particular visibility and urgency. The assemblies and pump room gatherings that formed the center of Bath's social life provided a theater in which young women and their families enacted elaborate strategies to attract eligible men, while eligible men assessed potential wives according to considerations of beauty, accomplishment, connection, and dowry. The somewhat mercenary quality of these interactions conducted, according to elaborate protocols of introduction, dance partners, morning calls, and promenades, appeared with particular clarity in the concentrated social environment of a place dedicated explicitly to leisure, health-seeking, and the formation of new connections. The economic structure of Bath, dependent on the steady flow of visitors who came for the waters, the assemblies, and the opportunity to escape rural isolation or London's expense, created a society that mixed established residents with temporary visitors, wealthy families with those clinging to genteel status on modest means, the genuinely fashionable with those pretending to sophistication. This social fluidity, the constant arrival and departure of people whose backgrounds might be uncertain and whose claims to status might be exaggerated or fraudulent, differed from the more stable rural social hierarchies of villages like Steventon, where everyone knew everyone else's family history and financial circumstances. The anonymity possible in Bath, the opportunity for reinvention or deception, and the tolerance for a wider range of behavior than would have been acceptable in smaller communities, all contributed to a social atmosphere that Jane observed with interest, while also experiencing its less pleasant aspects through her family's increasingly strained circumstances. The furnished lodgings that the family occupied in Bath, moving from one set of rooms to another as leases expired or as financial considerations dictated changes, lacked the settled quality and personal attachment that had characterized the Steventon rectory where Jane had grown up. The transient quality of furnished rooms, with their generic furniture and their associations with previous tenants, prevented the kind of emotional investment in place that a permanent home allowed. The practical inconveniences of such lodgings, the landlords who might prove difficult, the neighbors whose behavior could not be predicted or controlled, and the absence of private outdoor space all contributed to a sense of displacement that affected daily life and perhaps also limited the psychological space available for sustained creative work. The social obligations that Bath imposed, with its expectations regarding proper dress for different occasions and its schedule of public events that required participation to maintain social standing, strained the family's resources while also consuming time and energy. The necessity of appearing fashionably dressed at assemblies and promenades, when money for new clothing was limited, required ingenuity in altering and refurbishing garments to achieve current styles. The practice of ordering fabrics and having dresses made by local mantua makers, then reworking these garments as fashions changed or as the dresses showed wear, occupied considerable attention while also serving as constant reminder of economic constraints. Jane's letters from this period frequently mention dress, fabrics, colors, and the relative success or failure of particular garments, reflecting both the social importance of appropriate dress and the practical challenge of maintaining appearances on limited means. The years following George Austen's death saw the family moving between temporary arrangements, staying with various relations, and trying to establish a sustainable household on their limited income. The experience of economic insecurity and dependency on the charity of better-situated family members marked this period with particular stress. The situation of genteel poverty, in which the necessity of maintaining appearances competed with shrinking resources, imposed both practical challenges and psychological strain. The three women, Mrs. Austen, Cassandra, and Jane, found themselves in precisely the vulnerable position that Jane had observed in various relations and that she would later explore with such nuance in her novels. The establishment of a more stable residence at Southampton in 1806, sharing a house with Frank Austen and his new wife, provided some relief from the uncertainty of the previous period. The house overlooked the harbor, and Jane's letters from this period describe the ships, the naval officers, and the social life of a busy port town. The proximity to the sea and to maritime activities brought her into more direct contact with the professional world of the Royal Navy, in which several of her brothers had established successful careers. The social patterns of Southampton, with its mix of naval families, commercial prosperity, and genteel retirement, differed from both rural Steventon and fashionable Bath, offering new material for observation. The daily routines in Southampton included the usual household management tasks, now shared between Jane, Cassandra, Mrs. Austen, and Frank Austen's wife. The practical work of running a household on limited means required constant attention to economy and efficient use of resources. Jane's letters from this period mention shopping for fabric, the preparation of food, walks into town for errands, and the social obligations of calling on neighbors and receiving calls in return. The fragments of time available for writing continued to be carved out from these competing demands, and Jane worked on revisions and attempted new compositions without yet achieving the breakthrough that would come with her move to Chawton. The patterns of reading and intellectual engagement that had characterized the Steventon years continued as far as circumstances allowed, though access to books became more challenging without her father's extensive library. The circulating libraries in both Bath and Southampton provided some access to new publications, and Jane's letters record opinions on contemporary novels, histories, and periodicals. She read voraciously when opportunity allowed, analyzing not only what succeeded in current popular fiction, but also what she considered failures or meretricious appeals to shallow tastes. Her critical faculty, always acute, developed through this constant exposure to both exemplary and mediocre contemporary writing. The social world of morning calls, evening parties, and occasional balls continued to provide both obligation and material for observation. Jane's letters to Cassandra, when they were separated, contain detailed descriptions of these social events: who attended, what they wore, what conversations occurred, which young people showed signs of attachment to each other, and which marriages were being arranged or hoped for. The minutiae of social interaction in the drawing rooms and assembly rooms of provincial English towns provided the raw material that Jane would transform into fictional scenes, though the letters themselves often strike a note of detachment or irony about the proceedings they describe, as though the observer stood slightly apart from full participation even while fulfilling the expected social rituals. The move to Chawton in 1809 provided the settled household and stable routine that allowed Jane Austen to return fully to serious literary work. Edward Austen, who had been adopted by wealthy relations and had inherited substantial estates, offered his mother and sisters the use of a cottage on his Hampshire property near the village of Chawton. The cottage, a substantial residence by most standards, though modest compared to the manor house where Edward's family lived, provided the three women with a permanent home and a degree of financial security through Edward's support and the modest income from their investments. The physical arrangement of the Chawton cottage supported Jane's work more effectively than any residence since Steventon. The cottage provided distinct spaces for different activities, and while Jane continued to write in common rooms rather than in private study, the settled quality of the household allowed for the re-establishment of regular routines. The mornings typically involved household tasks and correspondence, while the afternoons offered more extended periods for reading and writing. The location in a small village meant fewer intrusions from casual visitors than had been common in Bath or Southampton, though the family maintained social connections with the local gentry and received visits from relations and friends. Jane returned to the manuscripts she had written more than a decade earlier and began the process of extensive revision. First Impressions, the novel she had originally drafted during the 1790s, underwent thorough reworking to become Pride and Prejudice. The revision process involved not merely polishing the prose, but reconsidering the entire structure, refining the characterization, and sharpening the social observations that gave the novel its satirical edge. Similarly, Eleanor and Marianne was transformed from its original epistolary format into the third-person narrative that became Sense and Sensibility, a process that required reimagining how the story would be told and how the reader would access the inner lives of the characters. The question of publication required practical decisions about how to approach publishers and under what terms to offer her work. The literary marketplace remained uncertain territory for a woman writer without influential connections or a public reputation. The decision to publish anonymously, with her novels appearing as by a lady or by the author of, rather than under her own name, reflected both common practice for female authors and strategic thinking about how to present her work to the public. The anonymity provided some protection from the social awkwardness that might arise if her novels were reviewed harshly or if their satirical elements offended readers who recognized themselves in certain characters. Sense and Sensibility appeared in 1811, published on commission, meaning that Jane bore the financial risk of publication costs, while retaining profits after expenses. The novel received respectful, if not enthusiastic, reviews, with critics praising the natural dialogue and the careful delineation of character, while noting that the novel lacked the dramatic incidents and exotic settings popular in much contemporary fiction. The sales proceeded steadily, if not spectacularly, earning Jane a modest profit that encouraged her to proceed with plans to publish additional novels. Pride and Prejudice followed in January 1813, published by Thomas Egerton, the same publisher who had handled Sense and Sensibility. This novel, which Jane herself considered lighter and more sparkling than its predecessor, received warmer reviews and found more enthusiastic readers. The opening sentence, with its ironic observation about the universal truth regarding single men in possession of good fortunes, signaled the novel's satirical intent while drawing readers into the social world of courtship and marriage that the novel would explore through the experiences of the Bennet family. The success of Pride and Prejudice established Jane as a novelist of note, though still anonymous to the general public. The reviews of Pride and Prejudice praised the novel's natural dialogue, its lively heroine, and its ability to maintain reader interest without recourse to the melodramatic incidents or Gothic machinery that characterized much popular fiction. The critical review noted the novel's success in depicting ordinary life with humor and accuracy, while other notices commented favorably on the moral instruction provided through the contrast between Elizabeth Bennet's eventual happy marriage and the less fortunate outcomes experienced by characters who allowed vanity, greed, or imprudence to govern their choices. The commercial success of the novel, which sold out its first printing and required additional printings to meet demand, provided financial reward that exceeded Jane's earnings from Sense and Sensibility and confirmed her decision to continue pursuing publication. The growing awareness within literary circles and among avid readers that the anonymous author by a lady possessed distinctive talent began to generate speculation about the author's identity. Jane's anonymity, carefully maintained through family discretion, allowed her to observe discussions of her work and reactions to her novels without the social awkwardness that public identification might have created. The separation between her private life as a provincial gentlewoman and her public identity as a published author provided both protection and a certain freedom to write without concern for how her social acquaintances might respond to satirical portraits that occasionally drew on recognizable types from her observation of real individuals. The financial arrangements with publishers reflected both the commercial realities of the book trade and Jane's developing understanding of her work's value. The sale of Pride and Prejudice to Egerton for £110 provided immediate payment without the risk of commission publishing, though it also meant that Jane received no further income regardless of the novel's subsequent success. This trade-off between guaranteed payment and potential greater earnings from profit-sharing arrangements represented a constant calculation for authors who had to balance their immediate need for income against the possibility of greater returns if a work proved exceptionally popular. Jane's later arrangements with John Murray for Emma would reflect her increased confidence in negotiating favorable terms, though even these remained modest compared to the sums commanded by more commercially successful writers of the period. The daily rhythm at Chawton during these years of productivity included the practical work of copying out fair copies of her manuscripts for submission to publishers, a time-consuming process given the length of the novels and the necessity of producing legible text without the aid of professional scribes. Jane worked steadily through these practical tasks, while also beginning new projects and continuing to revise earlier work. Mansfield Park, begun at Chawton, represented a more ambitious and complex undertaking than either of the earlier published novels, with a larger cast of characters, a more sustained examination of moral questions, and a darker emotional tone in its treatment of the heroine's position as a dependent relation in her wealthy uncle's household. The composition of Mansfield Park proceeded during a period when Jane had achieved a degree of confidence in her abilities and her methods that allowed for greater ambition in scope and treatment. The novel's examination of the position of the dependent relation, living on sufferance in a wealthy household and obligated to demonstrate gratitude while suppressing resentment or criticism of those who provided support, drew on Jane's own experience of economic vulnerability and her observations of how such dependencies affected behavior and character. Fanny Price's position as the poor relation brought to Mansfield Park as an act of ostensible charity while actually serving the function of useful companion and eventually governess to her younger cousins reflected a common pattern in genteel families of the period where poorer relations provided essentially unpaid labor while maintaining the fiction that their presence resulted from family affection rather than economic calculation. The moral complexity of Mansfield Park extended beyond Fanny's position to examine how wealth corrupted character through enabling self-indulgence, how charm without underlying principle proved dangerous, and how the maintenance of domestic order required constant vigilance against the forces of selfishness and moral laxity. The Crawfords, Henry and Mary, represented sophisticated worldliness and attractive manners that masked ethical deficiencies, while Sir Thomas Bertram's authority proved insufficient to protect his family from the consequences of his neglectful parenting and his prioritization of status and appearance over genuine moral education. The novel's relatively dark vision of family life, Its suggestion that even apparently respectable households could harbor dysfunction and that economic power enabled abuse marked a departure from the lighter social satire of the earlier novels. The reception of Mansfield Park among readers and critics revealed the challenges inherent in presenting a less immediately appealing heroine and more complex moral situations. Some readers appreciated the novel's seriousness and its subtle psychological observation, while others found Fanny passive and priggish, the pacing slow, and the ultimate rewarding of her virtue with marriage to Edmund unconvincing or unsatisfying. The debates about whether Fanny represented an admirable moral exemplar or an unappealing exemplification of timidity and overly scrupulous conscience began during Jane's lifetime and have continued through subsequent generations of readers and critics. Jane's own defense of Fanny in response to family members who criticized the heroine suggested her awareness of the risks she had taken in creating a protagonist so different from Elizabeth Bennet's liveliness or Emma Woodhouse's confidence. The professional relationship with John Murray, Byron's publisher, that developed with the publication of Emma represented a significant advance in Jane's position within the literary marketplace. Murray's willingness to publish her work associated her with prestige literary projects and suggested recognition of her talent by the publishing establishment. The negotiations over terms, with Murray offering to purchase the copyright outright rather than publishing on commission as Egerton had done, required Jane and Henry to calculate whether the guaranteed payment exceeded what she might earn through commission arrangement if the novel sold well. The decision to accept commission terms rather than selling the copyright reflected confidence in Emma's commercial prospects and determination to retain potential for greater earnings if the novel succeeded with readers. The technical achievement of Emma lay particularly in its sustained maintenance of the heroine's point of view, while allowing readers to perceive truths about characters and situations that Emma herself misunderstood or failed to recognize. The narrative technique that filtered events through Emma's consciousness, while also providing readers with enough information to question her judgments, created a complex relationship between reader and protagonist as readers found themselves simultaneously identifying with Emma and recognizing her blindnesses. The gradual revelation that Emma's certainty about understanding Harriet's feelings and Jane Fairfax's situation had been entirely wrong, that she had misread Frank Churchill's character and behavior, and, most significantly, that she had failed to recognize her own feelings for Mr. Knightley until his apparent attachment to Harriet forced recognition, demonstrated sophisticated handling of narrative perspective and character psychology. The social world of Emma, centered on the village of Highbury and its relatively modest gentry families, differed from the broader canvas of Mansfield Park or the movement between different locations that had characterized Pride and Prejudice. The decision to focus on a circumscribed social world where everyone knew everyone else's business and where even the smallest events generated extensive discussion and speculation allowed for intensive examination of how social hierarchies functioned at the level of daily interaction. Emma's position as the First Lady of Highbury, based on her father's standing and their relative wealth compared to other local families, created expectations about her behavior and her obligations to maintain proper social order through appropriate exercise of her influence and patronage. The treatment of social class in Emma examined distinctions between established gentry families like the Woodhouses and rising families whose wealth came from trade, between the respectable poverty of the Bateses and the different kind of poverty represented by Harriet Smith's illegitimate birth and lack of family connections. The novel's attention to these gradations, to how characters' awareness of their relative status influenced their behavior and expectations, and to the consequences of transgressing social boundaries, demonstrated Jane's sustained interest in how English society organized itself and maintained distinctions that could appear arbitrary or even comic to outside observation, but that governed behavior and determined possibilities with very real force. The publication of Mansfield Park in 1814 demonstrated Jane's growing confidence in her craft and her willingness to challenge readers with a less immediately appealing heroine and more complex moral situations. Fanny Price, timid and apparently passive, lacked the wit and sparkle of Elizabeth Bennet or the emotional intensity of Marianne Dashwood. The novel examined the corruptions of wealth, the moral dangers of charming manners without underlying principle, and the psychological effects of living in a state of dependency and obligation. Critics and readers responded with more mixed reactions than they had given to Pride and Prejudice, with some finding the novel's moral seriousness admirable, while others missed the lighter touch of the earlier work. The professional aspects of Jane's life as a published author remained largely invisible to her social world beyond her immediate family. She continued to attend to household duties, to participate in the social rituals of visiting and receiving calls, and to maintain the appearance of a genteel spinster living quietly in a country village. The creative work that occupied so much of her mental and emotional energy occurred largely in private, revealed only to family members who served as trusted first readers and critics. Her brother Henry, who had abandoned a career in banking to enter the church, acted as her informal literary agent, dealing with publishers on her behalf and promoting her work through his social connections in London. The income from her publications, while modest by comparison to the earnings of poets like Lord Byron or popular novelists who commanded large advances, provided Jane with a degree of financial independence she had not previously known. The money allowed her to purchase small luxuries, to help her mother with household expenses, and to feel less entirely dependent on her brother's charity. The psychological significance of this earned income exceeded its actual amount, providing validation of her work and a tangible measure of public reception beyond the approval of family and friends. Emma appeared in late 1815, published by John Murray, a more prestigious publisher than Egerton. Murray was Byron's publisher, and his willingness to take on Jane's work signaled growing recognition of her literary merit. Emma represented in some ways Jane's most technically accomplished work to date, with its sustained focus on the consciousness of a single character and its careful plotting of the gradual revelation of emotional truths that the heroine herself has failed to recognize. Emma Woodhouse, privileged and somewhat spoiled, possessed none of the economic vulnerability or social disadvantage that had characterized Jane's previous heroines, allowing for a different kind of examination of moral blindness and the growth of self-knowledge. The dedication of Emma to the Prince Regent occurred under circumstances that demonstrated both the honor and the constraint involved in such royal attention. The Prince Regent, having heard of Jane's authorship through connections at court, had his librarian suggest that she might dedicate her next novel to him. The suggestion, framed as permission, carried the force of royal command, and despite Jane's personal disapproval of the Prince Regent's character and conduct, particularly his treatment of his wife, she produced the required dedication. The incident illustrated the complex relationship between artistic autonomy and social obligation, as well as the peculiar position of a woman writer whose work brought her to the attention of public figures, while her gender and unmarried status limited her freedom to refuse their requests. The years of literary productivity at Chawton occurred against a background of broader family concerns and periodic disruptions to the settled routine that Jane had established. Her brother Henry's banking business, which had appeared successful during the wartime economy, collapsed in 1816, creating financial reverberations throughout the Austen family. Henry had been Jane's literary agent and supporter, and his personal financial crisis both distracted him from these activities and raised questions about the security of money that various family members had invested with his firm. The failure of the bank demonstrated once again the precariousness of financial security, even for those who seemed well established, a theme that had always informed Jane's novels and now pressed upon her personal circumstances with renewed force. The question of how to handle the manuscript that would become Northanger Abbey presented its own complications during these years. The novel, originally drafted under the title Susan during the Bath years and sold to the publisher Crosby in 1803, had never appeared in print despite the publisher's payment for the copyright. Jane, through Henry's intervention, had bought back the copyright in 1816, recovering her manuscript after more than a decade in which it had sat unpublished in Crosby's possession. The need to revise the manuscript, which reflected the literary fashions and topical references of an earlier period, competed with her work on new projects and her gradual recognition that her health was beginning to decline. The publisher's failure to bring out Northanger Abbey, despite purchasing the copyright, represented one of the frustrations inherent in the publishing system of the period. Publishers acquired manuscripts for various reasons beyond immediate publication plans, to prevent competitors from acquiring potentially valuable properties, to maintain relationships with authors who might produce more commercially successful work, or simply because the manuscript had seemed promising at the time of purchase, but later appeared less likely to succeed in a changed market. Jane's inability to force publication or to recover her manuscript without repurchasing it demonstrated the limited power authors possessed once they had sold their work, even when publishers failed to fulfill the implicit promise of publication that accompanied copyright purchase. The revision of Northanger Abbey required attention to the ways in which the Gothic novel, which the manuscript parodied, had evolved during the intervening years. The Gothic fashion had reached its peak during the 1790s and early 1800s, making Jane's satire of its conventions timely when she first drafted the novel. By 1816, the Gothic mode had transformed and diversified, with some authors incorporating Gothic elements into more psychologically complex narratives, while others had moved toward historical romance or domestic realism. Jane's decision to add an advertisement acknowledging the manuscript's vintage and explaining that it had been purchased long ago by a publisher who chose not to issue it reflected both practical necessity and an attempt to manage reader expectations about encountering references to publications and fashions that might seem dated. The composition of Persuasion, which Jane began in 1815 and completed in the summer of 1816, occurred as she became increasingly aware of physical symptoms that suggested serious illness. The narrative focus on a heroine past the first bloom of youth who receives an unexpected second chance at happiness perhaps reflected Jane's own consciousness of aging and the closing of certain possibilities, though the connections between an author's life and her fictional creations remain inevitably speculative and uncertain. The novel's treatment of the Navy, its emphasis on professional merit rather than inherited rank, and its relatively sympathetic portrayal of self-made men who had earned their fortunes through naval service, all suggested a shift in social perspective from the more satirical treatment of similar characters in earlier novels. The character of Anne Elliot, 27 years old at the novel's opening and considered past the age when marriage seemed likely, represented a departure from Jane's earlier heroines who had all been younger women at the beginnings of their adult lives. Anne's history of having refused Captain Wentworth 8 years earlier on the advice of Lady Russell, her godmother and surrogate mother, gave the novel a retrospective quality unusual in Jane's work, as much of the emotional weight derived from past events and missed opportunities rather than from the unfolding of new possibilities. The novel's exploration of whether prudent advice given by a well-meaning older person to a very young woman should be followed even when it contradicts the young woman's own judgment and desires raised questions about authority, autonomy, and the proper balance between caution and risk in making life-determining decisions. The revision of the novel's ending, documented through the survival of cancelled chapters that Jane wrote and then rejected, demonstrated her continuing perfectionism and her willingness to undertake substantial reworking even when illness was progressing. The original version of the ending, which brought Anne and Wentworth to their reconciliation through a more contrived series of events involving Admiral Croft's intervention, apparently failed to satisfy Jane's sense of how the emotional resolution should occur. The replacement chapters that she composed created a more psychologically satisfying conclusion through the scene in which Anne and Captain Harville discuss the relative constancy of men's and women's feelings, while Wentworth overhears and writes his letter declaring his unchanged love. This revision, completed when Jane was already experiencing symptoms that would lead to her death within a year, showed that her critical faculty and her commitment to achieving the right emotional effect remained undiminished, even as her physical strength declined. The themes of persuasion included not only second chances and the vindication of steadfast feeling, but also a somewhat darker examination of the Elliot family's vanity, financial irresponsibility, and the consequences of valuing rank over merit. Sir Walter Elliot's obsession with his baronetcy and his position in the peerage, his neglect of his financial affairs leading to near bankruptcy, and his inability to recognize merit in anyone lacking noble birth or fashionable appearance created problems that his middle daughter Anne must navigate while also managing her own emotional situation. The novel's suggestion that the old order represented by Sir Walter and his values had become hollow, and that newer men of professional accomplishment like Captain Wentworth and his fellow naval officers represented England's actual strength and future, aligned with broader social changes occurring during the Regency period. The question of persuadability, which gave the novel its title, extended beyond Anne's initial acceptance of Lady Russell's counsel to encompass various characters' susceptibility to influence from others. Mrs. Musgrove's easily swayed opinions, the Musgrove daughters' enthusiasms shaped by whoever they most recently encountered, William Elliot's apparent agreeability that masked calculated self-interest, and even Lady Russell's eventual revision of her judgment of Wentworth, all demonstrated different forms of persuadability or resistance to persuasion. The novel's implicit argument seemed to favor a balanced position that could receive advice and consider others' perspectives, while ultimately trusting one's own judgment when sufficient time and experience had matured that judgment, a position consistent with Anne's eventual decision to value her own constancy over the prudent caution that had led her to refuse Wentworth originally. The beginning of another novel, the work that would remain unfinished and be known posthumously as Sanditon, showed Jane attempting something different in tone and approach, even as her health failed. The fragment that survives presents a satirical examination of a seaside resort town being developed for profit, with attention to the commercial motives and self-interested exaggerations of those promoting the town's supposed advantages. The character of Mr. Parker, enthusiastically promoting Sanditon while remaining oblivious to the gap between his optimistic projections and reality, suggested a comedy of delusion and commercial speculation. The fragment's sharp observation of the developing resort culture, the attempts to create fashionable destinations through advertising and investment rather than through established reputation, and the mixture of genuine belief and knowing manipulation involved in such enterprises indicated that Jane's satirical powers remained acute even as her ability to sustain extended composition diminished. The practical work of revision and fair copying continued as Jane's condition allowed, with attention to preparing Northanger Abbey and Persuasion for eventual publication, while also working on the new project. The physical demands of writing, always considerable, in an age of quill pens and manual copying, became increasingly difficult as strength and stamina declined. The letters from this period occasionally mention writing as tiring, or mention periods when writing became impossible, though Jane characteristically minimized complaints and attempted to maintain a tone of normalcy in her correspondence even as her situation grew more serious. The working methods that Jane had developed during her productive years at Chawton began to show signs of strain as her health deteriorated. She continued to write, beginning another novel that would remain unfinished at her death, but the physical act of writing, always laborious in an age of quill pens that required frequent resharpening and paper that required careful management, became increasingly difficult. The symptoms she experienced, fatigue, back pain, skin discoloration, weakness, went undiagnosed in an era when medical knowledge remained limited and many conditions lacked effective treatments or even accurate identification. The continued need to maintain household routines and social obligations despite her illness reflected both the practical demands of a shared household and the social expectations regarding genteel behavior. Jane's letters from this period mention her symptoms in passing, often with attempts at humor or minimization, while also describing the ordinary details of daily life: visits paid and received, needlework completed, opinions on newly published books, news of relatives and friends. The maintenance of normalcy in correspondence and in daily interactions masked the severity of the illness that was gradually overtaking her. The question of seeking medical treatment required both financial resources and access to physicians whose expertise might offer some hope of diagnosis or relief. The decision to consult a physician in Winchester, made as Jane's condition worsened in 1817, represented both a recognition of the seriousness of her illness and an act of hope that something might be done. The choice of Winchester, rather than seeking treatment in London or Bath, reflected both practical considerations about where Jane might be comfortable and accessible to family, and the reputation of the Winchester physician who had treated other members of the Austen family. The move to Winchester in May 1817, ostensibly to be closer to medical care, marked an acknowledgment that Jane's condition required more than home nursing. Cassandra accompanied her to lodgings on College Street, maintaining the partnership that had sustained them both through decades of shared life. The routine in the Winchester lodgings revolved around managing symptoms, receiving visits from family members who could travel to Winchester, and attempting to maintain some semblance of the reading and conversation that had always characterized the sisters' relationship. Jane continued to work on revision of Persuasion during the early weeks in Winchester, though the physical effort of writing became increasingly difficult. The nature of Jane's illness, which medical historians have retrospectively attempted to diagnose as Addison's disease or lymphoma or various other conditions based on the symptoms described in letters and later recollections, remained mysterious to her contemporaries. The treatments available offered little beyond palliative care: rest, attention to diet, laudanum for pain. The physician's visits provided reassurance and the comfort of professional attention, but no effective intervention to halt or reverse the disease's progression. The gradual decline occurred over weeks, with periods of relative stability alternating with worsening symptoms. The emotional weight of this final illness fell most heavily on Cassandra, who had been Jane's closest companion throughout their lives, and who now attended her sister through the deterioration of her health. The practical arrangements of nursing, the management of communications with other family members, and the maintenance of hope all rested primarily on Cassandra's shoulders. Other family members visited when they could, and Jane's brothers provided financial support for medical expenses and lodgings, but the day-to-day reality of illness and care occurred in the private space shared by the two sisters. The question of Jane's literary legacy received some attention during these final months, with discussions about arranging for the publication of Northanger Abbey and Persuasion, and ensuring that fair copies existed of her various manuscripts. Henry, despite his recent financial difficulties, maintained his role as literary executor and advocate, preparing for the eventual need to see Jane's remaining work through to publication. The practical details of copyright, publishers' terms, and manuscript preparation intruded occasionally into the more immediate concerns of managing pain and maintaining whatever comfort could be achieved. The weeks in Winchester during the early summer of 1817 established a routine bounded by the limits of Jane Austen's declining strength and the efforts of those around her to maintain comfort and connection. The lodgings on College Street, modest rooms secured near the physician's residence, provided space enough for the patient and her primary caregiver. Cassandra's presence remained constant, attending to the practical needs of nursing while also managing correspondence with family members who sought news of Jane's condition and who expressed their concern and affection through letters when distance prevented personal visits. The daily rhythms simplified to essentials as Jane's energy diminished. The morning hours often brought slight improvement after the rest of night, allowing for brief conversations, the reading aloud of passages from books, or attention to letters that arrived from family and friends. The afternoons typically saw increased fatigue and discomfort, requiring careful positioning to ease back pain and the administration of what limited relief medical science could provide through medications that dulled pain without addressing underlying causes. The evenings passed quietly, with Cassandra sitting nearby, available for whatever needs might arise during the night. The Winchester physician continued his visits, conducting examinations and adjusting treatments according to the progression of symptoms he observed. His assessments, delivered with the professional reassurance expected of medical practitioners, could not conceal the essential trajectory of the illness. The consultations provided a structure to the days and maintained a sense that something was being done, that expertise was being applied to the situation, even as the limits of that expertise became increasingly apparent. The physician's visits also served a social function, providing adult company beyond the immediate family and connecting the sick room to the larger world of medical knowledge and professional authority. The medical understanding of the period, based largely on humoral theory and observations of symptoms without access to the diagnostic technologies that would later transform medical practice, could offer little precise explanation for Jane's condition. The symptoms she presented, the fatigue that grew progressively more debilitating, the discoloration of her skin that suggested some systemic disturbance, the back pain that prevented comfortable rest, the episodes of fever and weakness, could have indicated various underlying conditions, none of which admitted of effective treatment given the state of medical knowledge. The physician's treatments, which likely included recommendations regarding diet, rest, and the judicious use of opiates for pain management, represented the standard care available to patients suffering from chronic wasting illnesses whose precise nature remained mysterious. The routine of correspondence between Cassandra in Winchester and the rest of the family provided both practical information about Jane's condition and emotional support for those who could not be present. Mrs. Austen's responses from Chawton expressed maternal concern while also attending to the practical matters of household management that continued to require decisions despite the crisis in Winchester. The letters from Jane's brothers, written when their various occupations allowed, conveyed affection and worry while also addressing questions about expenses, medical consultations, and the practical arrangements that illness necessitated. The maintenance of this correspondence network, with letters traveling by regular post between Winchester, Chawton, and the various locations where Jane's brothers pursued their careers, created a sense of family connection that partially compensated for physical distance. The news from Chawton arrived regularly through letters from Mrs. Austen, who remained at the cottage maintaining the household and receiving reports from Cassandra about Jane's condition. The letters between Cassandra and her mother, preserved in part and later described by family members, balanced honesty about Jane's failing health with attempts to manage worry and maintain whatever hope circumstances allowed. The practical matters of the household at Chawton continued to require attention and decision-making, even as the primary concern of all family members centered on the sick room in Winchester. Jane's brothers, occupied with their various careers and responsibilities, visited when circumstances permitted. Henry, whose recent ordination meant he now held a curacy in addition to managing the aftermath of his banking failure, came to Winchester to see his sister and to attend to the practical arrangements that illness necessitated. James, the eldest brother and now rector of Steventon, traveled from his parish when his duties allowed. Frank and Charles, both naval officers with commands that took them away from England for extended periods, had less opportunity for visits, though their letters expressed concern and affection. The composition of letters became increasingly difficult for Jane as her strength failed, though she maintained correspondence as long as she physically could. The letters from this final period, brief and occasionally written in pencil when holding a pen became too taxing, expressed gratitude for the care she received and made light of her discomfort with the characteristic attempt at humor that had marked her earlier correspondence. The effort required to write even short notes became eventually too great, and Jane's direct communication with family and friends beyond Cassandra ceased as she became too weak to hold a writing implement or to sustain the concentration required for composition. The reading that had been such a constant feature of Jane's life continued as long as she could focus on the words on a page, and then continued through Cassandra's reading aloud when Jane's own vision or concentration failed. The books that had provided both entertainment and professional study throughout the years of active writing now served primarily as distraction and comfort, read not for analysis or critical engagement, but simply for the familiar pleasure of narrative and the connection to a world beyond the immediate physical discomfort of illness. The management of visitors required careful judgment about when Jane's energy allowed for company and when the strain of maintaining conversation exceeded her capacity. Close family members understood that visits must be brief and undemanding, that Jane's participation in conversation would be limited, and that the primary purpose of their presence was to provide connection and support rather than to seek entertainment or extensive exchange. The gradual narrowing of Jane's world to the sick room, the immediate necessities of physical care, and the small circle of closest relations marked the progression of her decline. The question of hope, which had sustained the early weeks of treatment, gave way gradually to a recognition that recovery was not likely, and that the focus must shift to comfort and the management of symptoms. This transition occurred not through explicit announcement, but through the accumulation of small acknowledgments. The physician's more guarded prognoses, the family's arrangements to ensure that someone remained nearby at all times, the shift in conversation from plans for future return to Chawton to immediate concerns of pain management and comfort. The preparations for what now appeared inevitable included practical considerations about how the death of an unmarried woman of modest means should be managed and what arrangements should be made for burial and memorial. The family's connection to Winchester Cathedral, where several of Jane's ancestors were buried, suggested a possible resting place, though the details of such arrangements required delicate negotiation and the payment of fees that the family's limited resources made significant. Henry undertook these practical discussions, sparing Cassandra the burden of such negotiations while she attended to the more immediate demands of nursing. Jane Austen died in the early morning hours of July 18, 1817, in the Winchester lodgings on College Street. Cassandra, who had maintained her vigil through the night, was present at the end. The death, when it came, brought the release that comes with the cessation of suffering, though it also marked the final severing of the partnership that had sustained both sisters throughout their lives. The practical necessities that follow death, the notification of family members, the arrangements with the undertaker, the selection of burial clothes, occupied the immediate hours after Jane's passing, providing structure and purpose during the first shock of grief. The funeral took place on July 24th, with Jane's burial in the north aisle of Winchester Cathedral. The choice of this location, prestigious and permanent, reflected the family's desire to honor Jane's memory appropriately, despite their limited financial means. The funeral service followed the standard Anglican rites, attended by Jane's brothers and other male family relations, while Cassandra and Mrs. Austen remained at home according to the customs of the period that excluded women from attending funerals. The monument later erected in the cathedral made no mention of Jane's literary work, identifying her instead through her family relationships and her personal virtues of faith and charity. The question of Jane's unpublished manuscripts required immediate attention in the weeks following her death. Henry, acting as literary executor, arranged with John Murray for the publication of Northanger Abbey and Persuasion together in a 4-volume set. Henry composed a biographical notice to accompany these posthumous publications, the first public identification of Jane Austen as the author of the novels that had appeared anonymously during her lifetime. The biographical notice, brief and necessarily constrained by both family privacy and Victorian conventions about what could be said publicly about a gentlewoman, presented Jane as a dutiful daughter and sister whose literary work had emerged naturally from her domestic circumstances without disrupting her primary duties and relationships. The publication of Northanger Abbey and Persuasion in December 1817 completed the catalogue of Jane's finished novels, making available to readers the full scope of her work. The novels received respectful notices in the critical press, though they generated less immediate excitement than might have attended new work from a living author. The revelation of Jane's authorship, accomplished through Henry's biographical notice, provided readers with a sense of the person behind the anonymous publications and began the process of constructing a public identity for an author who had carefully maintained her privacy during her lifetime. The years immediately following Jane's death saw modest but steady interest in her work from readers who discovered the novels through circulating libraries and recommendations from those who had encountered them earlier. The novels remained in print through various editions, finding audiences among those who appreciated the careful social observation, the moral intelligence, and the technical skill displayed in the construction of plot and character. The reputation that developed during these early years after her death characterized Jane as a miniaturist of domestic life, someone who worked within narrow boundaries of subject matter, but who rendered those subjects with precision and insight. The manuscript of the unfinished novel, eventually known as Sanditon, remained in family possession along with various other papers and letters. These materials, viewed as private family documents, rather than public literary property, were not published during the lifetime of those who had known Jane personally. The preservation of manuscripts and correspondence occurred through the care of Cassandra and later through other family members who recognized the potential value of these materials, even as they maintained control over their circulation and publication. Cassandra lived for more than 28 years after Jane's death, maintaining her residence at Chawton Cottage with Mrs. Austen until their mother's death in 1827. The loss of Jane left Cassandra alone in a fundamental way that subsequent family relationships could not entirely fill, despite the continued attention and affection of brothers, nephews, nieces, and friends. Cassandra's guardianship of Jane's memory and manuscripts shaped what information became available to the broader public about Jane's life and character, as Cassandra controlled access to letters and made decisions about what materials should be preserved and what should be destroyed to protect privacy. The gradual growth of Jane Austen's readership during the Victorian era occurred without the marketing machinery or critical establishment that would later attend literary reputations. Readers discovered the novels through recommendation, library borrowing, and the availability of relatively affordable editions. The appreciation that developed among this readership valued the moral seriousness, the reward given to virtue, and the preservation of social order that Victorian readers found in Jane's endings, even as these readers necessarily missed or ignored the satirical edge and social criticism that complicated the apparent conservatism of the novel's conclusions. The publication of James Edward Austen Leigh's Memoir of Jane Austen in 1870 provided the first extended biographical account, drawing on family memories and presenting Jane according to Victorian ideals of feminine propriety and domestic virtue. The memoir emphasized Jane's modesty, her devotion to family, and her lack of literary ambition beyond the natural expression of her talents. This presentation, while limiting in many respects, helped to establish Jane's reputation among a wider reading public by making her life appear exemplary according to contemporary standards while vouching for the moral propriety of her novels. The assessment of Jane Austen's literary significance evolved gradually through the late 19th and early 20th centuries as critical attention began to examine her technical innovations in narrative perspective, her sophisticated handling of free indirect discourse, and her complex representation of consciousness. The recognition that her work represented not merely pleasing domestic fiction, but serious artistic achievement, developed through the advocacy of critics who analyzed how her novels functioned as literature rather than simply evaluating them as moral instruction or social documentation. The manuscripts, letters, and other archival materials related to Jane Austen's life and work gradually became objects of scholarly study as universities established programs in English literature and as the professionalization of literary criticism created demand for original sources. The controlled release of information about Jane's life, managed by family members through successive generations, meant that biographical knowledge accumulated slowly and that the construction of Jane Austen as a literary figure occurred through complex negotiations between scholarly inquiry and family guardianship of private materials. The locations associated with Jane Austen's life, Steventon, Bath, Southampton, Chawton, Winchester, became sites of literary pilgrimage as her readership grew and as interest in the biographical context of her work intensified. The preservation of Chawton Cottage as a museum dedicated to Jane's life and work provided physical access to the spaces where she wrote and lived, allowing visitors to imagine the domestic circumstances within which the novels were composed. The transformation of these private spaces into public sites of cultural memory reflected the ongoing process through which Jane Austen's life became material for public interpretation and commemoration. The translation of Jane Austen's novels into other languages carried her work beyond the English-speaking readership for which it had been originally written, though translation necessarily altered aspects of the social specificity and linguistic precision that characterized the original texts. The reception of the novels in different cultural contexts revealed both their particularity to English social structures of the early 19th century and their capacity to engage readers whose own experience of social hierarchy, courtship, and family obligation differed significantly from the world Jane depicted. The continuing scholarly attention to Jane Austen's work, examining her novels through various critical methodologies and theoretical frameworks, demonstrated the richness of the texts and their capacity to sustain repeated analysis from different perspectives. The questions raised about gender, class, economic power, marriage as economic transaction, the constraints on women's autonomy, and the techniques of narrative representation found in Jane's novels remained relevant to successive generations of readers and critics, ensuring that the work maintained its position in academic study and general readership alike. The manuscripts, carefully preserved through nearly 2 centuries, provided evidence of Jane's working methods, her processes of revision, and the development of her craft over time. The cancelled chapters of Persuasion, showing Jane's dissatisfaction with her first attempt at the novel's resolution and her extensive reworking of the ending, offered insight into her critical judgment of her own work and her willingness to undertake substantial revision when the initial attempt failed to satisfy her standards. The correspondence that survived Cassandra's later destruction of letters, while fragmentary and weighted toward certain periods and relationships, provided direct access to Jane's voice in its less formal mode, revealing the wit, the sometimes caustic observations, the family affections, and the practical concerns that occupied her attention across the years. The letters, read alongside the novels, complicated simple biographical interpretations, while also enriching understanding of the social world and personal preoccupations that informed her fiction. The decision by Cassandra to destroy a substantial portion of Jane's correspondence after her own death reflected Victorian sensibilities about privacy and the proper representation of female authors to the public. Cassandra's careful curation of what materials would survive determined much of what later generations could know about Jane's daily life, personal opinions, and creative processes. The letters that Cassandra chose to preserve emphasized Jane's family devotion, her participation in ordinary domestic activities, and her modest approach to her literary work, while presumably removing correspondence that might have revealed less conventionally proper attitudes or more ambitious literary aspirations. This selective preservation shaped the biographical record in ways that continue to influence how Jane Austen is understood as both author and historical figure. The gradual expansion of Jane Austen's literary reputation during the late 19th century occurred as part of broader changes in how novels were valued and studied. The rise of university English departments created institutional structures for the serious study of literature, while the professionalization of literary criticism established methodologies for analyzing how novels functioned as artistic achievements rather than merely as moral instruction or entertainment. Jane's novels, with their technical sophistication and their complex representation of social relations, proved particularly amenable to this new critical attention. The recognition of her innovations in narrative technique, particularly her development of free indirect discourse as a method for representing characters' thoughts while maintaining narrative distance and ironic perspective, established her as a significant figure in the history of the novel form. The feminist scholarship of the late 20th century brought new attention to the ways in which Jane's novels examined women's limited options within patriarchal social structures and the economic realities that shaped marriage as a transaction involving property, status, and security rather than primarily romantic attachment. The recognition that Jane's heroines navigate worlds in which their survival depends on making advantageous marriages, while the novels simultaneously critique the system that creates this dependency, revealed the complexity of her social critique and complicated earlier readings that had emphasized primarily the moral and romantic aspects of the stories. This scholarship demonstrated how Jane's fiction contained more radical implications than Victorian readers had recognized, though debates continued about whether her work ultimately endorsed or subverted the social order it depicted. The question of Jane Austen's relationship to the broader historical events of her lifetime, the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, the social and economic transformations accompanying early industrialization, generated scholarly discussion about what her relative silence on these matters might signify. Some critics argued that her focus on the domestic sphere and the social relations of a narrow segment of English society represented a deliberate choice to write about what she knew intimately, rather than attempting to address subjects beyond her direct experience. Others suggested that the apparent absence of historical events from her novels masked a more subtle engagement with the social changes occurring during her lifetime, visible in references to the professions, to social mobility, to the Navy, and to economic pressures that inform the situations of her characters, even when larger historical forces remain outside the frame of the narratives. The adaptations of Jane Austen's novels for stage, film, and television, which proliferated during the late 20th and early 21st centuries, introduced her work to audiences who might not have encountered the novels through reading. These adaptations necessarily interpreted and transformed the original texts, making choices about which aspects of plot and character to emphasize, how to visualize settings and costumes, and how to render dialogue that was written for the page into performances for visual media. The popularity of these adaptations contributed to Jane Austen's position in popular culture, while also raising questions about how far adapted versions could diverge from their sources while still claiming connection to Jane's authorial vision and what was gained or lost in translation between written narrative and visual performance. The phenomenon of Austen mania or Janeite culture, characterized by intense fan devotion, tourism to sites associated with Jane's life, costume recreation, and the production of sequels, prequels, and variations on her novels, demonstrated the particular appeal her work held for certain readers who found in her fiction an idealized vision of social order, romance, and moral clarity that contrasted with contemporary life's complexity and uncertainty. This phenomenon generated its own critical analysis examining what social and psychological needs this intense engagement with Jane's work might fulfill, and how the construction of Jane Austen as a cultural icon both reflected and distorted the actual historical person and her literary achievement. The establishment of Jane Austen societies, academic conferences dedicated to studying her work, and scholarly journals focusing on Austen studies demonstrated the institutionalization of serious engagement with her novels and life. the Jane Austen Society of North America, the Jane Austen Society of the United Kingdom, and various other national and regional organizations created networks of scholars, enthusiasts, and general readers who shared interest in preserving sites associated with Jane, promoting understanding of her work, and supporting ongoing research into all aspects of her life, times, and literary production. These organizations helped sustain both popular and academic interest across decades, while also serving as advocates for the preservation of manuscripts, locations, and other material remains connected to Jane's life. The ongoing publication of new scholarly editions of Jane's works, with extensive annotation and critical apparatus, reflected evolving understanding of her literary achievement and changing approaches to presenting historical texts to contemporary readers. The textual scholarship, examining surviving manuscripts, analyzing revisions, and establishing authoritative texts, addressed questions about Jane's compositional practices while also acknowledging the complexities involved in editing works that existed in multiple manuscript versions and early printed editions. The decisions editors made about what texts to use as copy texts, how to handle variant readings, and what information to provide in annotations influenced how readers encountered Jane's novels and what assumptions they brought to their reading. The critical industry that developed around Jane Austen's work, producing hundreds of books and thousands of articles analyzing every aspect of her novels from multiple theoretical perspectives, testified to the richness of her texts and their capacity to sustain varied interpretations. Feminist readings, Marxist analysis, post-colonial examinations of empire and slavery in the novels, queer theoretical approaches to desire and marriage, eco-critical studies of landscape and environment, cognitive and evolutionary perspectives on social intelligence and theory of mind. All of these critical methodologies found productive applications in studying Jane's work, demonstrating how her novels could speak to concerns and questions far removed from those of her own historical moment, while remaining firmly grounded in the specific social realities of early 19th century England. The preservation and display of material artifacts associated with Jane Austen's life, her writing desk, jewelry, clothing, locks of hair, manuscripts, letters, first editions, created tangible connections to the historical person, while also raising questions about the commodification of literary celebrity and the construction of authenticity through physical objects. The museums and archives holding these materials made them available for scholarly study, while also presenting them to the general public as relics worthy of pilgrimage and veneration. The market for Austen-related collectibles, memorabilia, and merchandise demonstrated the commercial dimension of literary reputation, while also suggesting the varied ways in which readers sought to express their connection to and appreciation for her work. The debates about Jane Austen's religious beliefs and their influence on her fiction reflected broader questions about how to understand the relationship between an author's personal convictions and their literary production. The evidence from her letters and the recollections of family members suggested conventional Anglican piety appropriate to her position as a clergyman's daughter and sister, while the novels themselves treated religious themes with varying degrees of emphasis and presented clergymen with satirical awareness of how clerical positions functioned within the social and economic structures of their time. The question of whether Jane's religious views informed the moral structures of her novels in substantial ways, or whether her fiction operated according to primarily social and psychological rather than theological principles, continued to generate scholarly discussion and interpretation. The establishment of creative writing courses and programs using Jane Austen's novels as models for studying narrative technique, character development, and dialogue construction demonstrated how her work functioned not merely as historical documents or objects of critical analysis, but as living examples of fictional craft from which aspiring writers could learn. The analysis of how Jane constructed scenes, managed point of view, deployed irony, and balanced various plot lines provided practical lessons in narrative technique while also revealing the conscious artistry behind what earlier readers had sometimes praised as natural or effortless achievement. This attention to Jane as craftsperson rather than merely inspired genius contributed to more nuanced understanding of how her novels worked and what made them effective. The translation of Jane Austen's novels into languages and cultural contexts far removed from early 19th century England tested the limits of their particularity and their capacity to communicate across linguistic and cultural boundaries. The challenge of rendering Jane's precise social distinctions, her ironic narrative voice, and her culture-specific vocabulary into other languages required translators to make difficult decisions about how much to explain and how much to trust readers to infer from context. The reception of these translations in different national literary traditions revealed both what remained accessible across cultural differences and what depended irreducibly on familiarity with the specific social world Jane depicted. The enduring presence of Jane Austen's novels in the canon of English literature, their continued assignment in educational curricula from secondary schools through university graduate programs, ensured that successive generations of readers encountered her work as part of their literary education. The pedagogical uses of the novels, teaching students about narrative technique, social history, the development of the novel form, or the position of women writers in literary history, meant that Jane's work continued to shape how readers understood both the possibilities of fiction and the social world of early 19th century England. The accessibility of her prose, the clarity of her narrative structures, and the recognizability of her themes of courtship, family relations, and social ambition across cultural and temporal distance contributed to her novel's sustainability as both objects of scholarly study and sources of reading pleasure. The cottage at Chawton, preserved as a museum dedicated to Jane Austen's life and work, became a destination for literary pilgrimage, where visitors could see the rooms where she wrote, examine personal possessions and manuscripts, and imagine the domestic circumstances within which the novels were composed. The transformation of this private domestic space into a public site of commemoration created opportunities for direct encounter with material remains of Jane's life, while also necessarily shaping how visitors understood that life through curatorial choices about what to emphasize and how to present the relationship between the historical person and the literary achievement. The museum served educational functions while also satisfying emotional needs of readers who sought tangible connection to an author whose work had meant much to them. The critical debates that continued to animate scholarly discussion of Jane Austen's work, examining questions of feminist politics, conservative ideology, colonialism and its traces in her fiction, formal innovation, psychological acuity, and religious belief, demonstrated both the complexity of her novels and their capacity to generate genuinely different interpretations based on what questions critics brought to their reading. The absence of definitive resolution to these interpretive debates, the way her novels could support readings that emphasized their critique of social structures as readily as readings that emphasized their apparent endorsement of those structures, reflected genuine ambiguities and complexities within the texts, rather than simply critical disagreement about straightforward meanings. The process through which Jane Austen became established as a major figure in English literature Moving from the modest recognition she received during her lifetime to her current position as one of the most widely read and studied English novelists occurred gradually through the accumulated force of readers' responses, critical attention, educational adoption, and popular cultural engagement. This process demonstrated how literary reputations develop through complex interactions between the qualities of the works themselves, the cultural needs and interests of successive generations of readers, the institutions that preserve and transmit literature, and the broader social contexts that shape what kinds of writing seem valuable or relevant at different historical moments. The novels remained, across all these transformations of reputation and uses, fundamentally what they had been when Jane completed them: carefully constructed narratives of courtship and marriage among the English gentry, written with precision, irony, and psychological insight, entertaining in their comedy and engaging in their moral intelligence, products of particular historical circumstances and individual talent. The reading experience that the novels offered, the pleasure of well-constructed plots, revealing character through action and dialogue, the satisfaction of watching protagonists achieve self-knowledge and finding happiness, and the comedy arising from the gap between characters' self-perceptions and their actual behavior, remained accessible across the historical distance that separated Jane's world from that of later readers. The continuing discovery of her work by new readers, generation after generation, suggested that what she had achieved in the sitting room at Chawton possessed qualities that transcended the immediate circumstances of their composition.